I'd like to introduce our very first guest for the evening, back for a blast from the past. Our first guest, born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland in 1723, Adam Smith is almost universally credited as the father of classical economics and one of the first theorists of capitalism. He's the author of an inquiry into the nature and cause of the wealth of nations, also known as The Wealth of Nations. Smith believed that in pursuing one's own self-interests and amassing wealth for one's own benefit, a citizen actually contributed to the increased wealth of the entire society. Simply put, if everyone acts in their own self-interest, everyone gets richer. He also coined the phrase invisible hand to describe an innate force that guides the market when it's free of government interference and regulation. While Smith's view of the free market were located in the context of his time, and were indeed quite nuanced, many contemporary economists have formulated his ideas into a set of rules that must not be deviated from. Our other first guest, Karl Marx, was born in Trier, Germany in 1818. Famed philosopher and co-author of the Communist Manifesto, he was a revolutionary who inspired the workers of the world to unite. His extensive research into economic systems throughout the history mapped the ways in which workers had been exploited by successive regimes and suggested that capitalism was the final phase of this historical process. Capitalism, he believed, would create a large industrial working class that would ultimately overthrow it, leading to a more equitable society. Capital, Critique of Political Economy, pinpointed Marx's desire for a pure communism, the destruction of class system, and inspired many of the social and political revolutions of the 20th century. He famously wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world. In various ways, the point, however, is to change it." Let's give it up for Adam and Karl.
Is this on? What is this?
Yeah, it's on. Stop touching it. It's probably expensive.
Well, hello, citizen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karl Marx.
I'm Adam Smith.
And we're
As you know.
Yeah. And we're very excited to be here with you in the future.
The future, yes.
So, I gotta be honest, I was expecting like a lot more robots and flying cars and dehydrated food pills.
Oh, no, I see a robot over there, Karl.
No, I think that's just a guy.
Oh.
Hey, you just a guy? Yeah, I think he's just a guy.
Fashion these days.
Yeah.
Ew. Well, you might all be wondering how we got here. It was through a giddy-making little invention called the Smart-O-Wave.
The Smart-O-Wave. This is a really cool gadget. It's like a microwave, but, tell them how it works.
Well, you put in the text of a classical philosopher, and then you go beep, 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 kablam!
Kablamo!
And we appear.
Yeah, just like that. Although, things could have gone pretty awry, if you know what I mean. Okay, so have you ever seen that movie, The Fly, with Jeff Goldblum? Well, okay, so he got, a fly in his teleporter. Wow, it's half fly man. Well, what if there was half of a hot pocket in the Smart-O-Wave? Well, that would have been a mess. Mozzarella Marx.
Yes. Well, we have come in at quite the vantage point. Everywhere we look, down, down, down go the graphs for the stock markets.
Oh, yeah, the economy. Look what you guys did with that one. I mean...
Shame on you.
Yeah, I told you capitalism would eventually lead to here. I did. I mean, I don't want to say I told you so, but I totally told you so.
Well, it's quite ridiculous. I mean, the only thing that seems to be going up in any direction is one thing.
My book sales! Yep. Although, so the economy goes down, book sales go up, but then people are buying the books, so it's kind of like refueling the economy, right? It's a vicious cycle, a paradox, a snake eating itself.
Well, people do ask us for answers all the time, and although Mr. Marx is sometimes a little bit strange in what he says...
We don't have any!
No, we don't. Quite frankly, it's been a long time since we wrote that stuff, and we've moved on.
Yeah, we have other interests.
My interest right now is invested in balsamic vinegar reductions.
And I'm interested in not totally lame things.
Well, yes, you can all stop laughing, thank you. Yes, so this last week we've been followed around by the paparazzi. We are still very popular.
Yeah, cameramen and like screaming fans will be following after us, and they'll all be like, "Sign my baby, kiss my t-shirt."
And for some reason they keep yelling at me, "Oh, come over here, George Washington."
George Washington, that's pretty good, George Washington.
Yes, well, they seem to be making a video of our exploits.
What you talk about, Smithy? A video?
Yes.
Oh, well, we better show them a clip.
Well, let's do that.
All right, well, you guys watch the clip, and we'll get out of here before our adoring fans maul us to death.
Here we go.
Oh, did I mention we can fly? Because I can totally fly. Whee!
Genius.
Yeah, this is okay, I guess.
Warhol, the master. The art stuff is a little difficult for you, old chap, I do understand, but I do think you'll like this one quite a lot. It was produced in a factory.
It is a product, and you know how much surplus value is in this thing?
So much
So they make it in the factory. Nobody buys this because, oh, look at how much work it took. Oh, yeah. Why would you think I would like this? It's like, this is capitalism-fueled capitalism. Nobody even thinks about the fact that there was factory workers. They just go, oh, Andy Warhol, some guy. You know, he takes all those pictures like Coca-Cola, which I hate, and then he turns it into a painting and makes millions and billions of dollars on it. And it makes
Now, I think you've got the point. Andy Warhol, he was minting his own money. And how was he doing it? Strictly on the basis of originality and creativity. It is precisely your sort of thing,
No,
Marx.
he's doing it, he's completely exploiting the idea of creativity.
Well, just because he made money on it doesn't mean that it doesn't express the absolute right of the worker's authenticity deep within the structure of the very silk screening and factory labor processes by which it was created. You know, Marx, let's just agree on one thing. We're both after societal good, are we not?
Yeah, I guess.
And we both want the human condition to advance, do we not?
Yeah, sure.
Well, then if you agree on these two principles, then obviously this artwork is really genius.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be $33 million to be genius.
It could be 34.
I would rather it was worth like, I don't know. Have you ever heard of Facebook?
What's that?
Does this have anything to do with Facebook? You know, it's got faces. You could, I don't know, put it in a book.
Well, I don't know, Marx. It's not the kind of literature I tend to read. You know, Marx, all of this pretending to be the proletariat is really getting tiresome.
You know what's tiresome? This painting.
Yes, indeed.
Hey, you scooch away from me! Don't you scooch away! Yeah, you go and scooch. You scooch right out that door.
Scooch if I like to.
So thank you again to Carl and to Adam for really kicking off tonight. And now I want to move on to speak to you about Baby Marx. Baby Marx began as artist Pedro Reyes' idea for a television sitcom in which puppet versions of key figures in the history of economics are brought back to life. intended as a way to make the lofty and often distorted fundamentals of socialism and capitalism accessible to a broad audience. The piece debuted as a short trailer at the 2008 Yokohama Triennial in Japan. In 2009, Reyes wrote and filmed a TV pilot episode with Japanese puppeteers in Mexico City, where he lives and works. The Walker phase of Baby Marx is a move away from television into experimental film. Reyes, in conversation with the exhibition's co-curators, Bartholomew Ryan and Camille Washington, is using the Walker as a kind of laboratory for working with local puppeteers, as you just saw, as well as for moments like tonight and this Saturday. Employing the tools and procedures of documentary filmmaking, the installation of Baby Marx includes the puppets and a monumental set used for the original pilot, an in-gallery production studio, and a series of events that offer a meditation on the intersections of entertainment, ideology, and contemporary art. We're delighted to have Pedro Reyes and two other special guests with us tonight. An architect by training, Reyes works across platforms and disciplines, including design, installation, and video, to explore collective interaction, scale and space, and pressing social issues. Reyes utilizes strategies developed for communication or education, as well as common sense and everyday humor to engage audiences. His work has been exhibited worldwide, including the Venice Biennale, the Carpenter Center at Harvard, the Serpentine Gallery in London, and the New Museum in New York. Pedro is joined on stage by two intellectual powerhouses, Lauren Berlant and Michael Hardt, to discuss some of their influential ideas on politics and economy as they relate to his project and its complex relationship to the current economic crisis. Lauren Berlant is the George M. Pullman Professor of English at the University of Chicago, where she helped found and has chaired the Center for Gender Studies. She works in the production of legal and effective public spheres in the US from the 19th century to the present, in particular, formal and informal modes of social belonging or citizenship, which might be organized according to political, racial, sexual, or economic status, or might be forged in everyday life. She also works on the public circulation of emotions like trauma, love, optimism, and political depression. She's the author of numerous texts referenced in your program notes. Her newest monograph, Cruel Optimism, will be published this October by Duke University Press. Michael Hardt is a political philosopher and literary theorist at Duke University in Chapel Hill. Hardt's recent writings focus primarily on deciphering various aspects of globalization through a style of writing he defines as eclecticism, connecting the ideas of various thinkers such as Karl Marx, Michel Foucault, Antonio Gramsci, and Thomas Jefferson. His most known works, Empire, Multitude, War and Democracy in the Age of Empire, and Commonwealth, were written in collaboration with Antonio Negri and are considered by many as major events in political and critical theory. Please help me in welcoming our guest to the stage.
I assume our microphones are on. Yes, I can hear.
I think so.
Right. I'm Michael, Lauren, Pedro. So we thought we'd start by asking Pedro a question about about Marx and about the project. In a way, there are two ways I'm thinking of it. One is that in the pilot that was mentioned in the intro, and in many of the other clips, not the one we saw, Pedro's working with Marx's texts, and in some ways a recuperation of Marx's texts. Like, I think it's in the pilot that there's an elaborate explanation of primitive cumulation of a Marxist concept. And so in some ways it seems to me that part of the pedagogical project that's going on here is a recuperation of Marx in contrast to received notions of Marxism. And the other thing, which I guess I'm posing these at the same time, is the strategies used to talk about Marx's ideas in a context in which, right, it's certainly not true in the US today that Marxism or Marx's ideas are in any way banned, but it's more like, I would say, under a sort of shroud of ridicule. And so I guess I want to hear a little bit about an introduction to the project, about that, about your approach to Marx here, and Marx's own thought, and this method of doing it via puppets in this discussion of ideas.
Well, what you just said about ridicule is very interesting, because when Marx is brought up in the news, etc., it's always almost like a synonym of failure, because of the places where his ideas have been implemented, but never in the context of where his ideas has been successful. And this reading is very, it's more present in the United States, perhaps in Mexico, because we had many administrations where there was a kind of a strong socialist element in certain periods, etc. That maybe there's not Marx is probably dust, covered in dust, but not so much used as with that kind of used in that context, no? So I think that it's very interesting, the fact that that ridicule is used, because if I felt at some point that that comedy was somehow one of the few mechanisms that could be used to brought Marx ideas back into a general audience. It's almost as if you were doing a reverse engineering of that kind of mocking of Marx, and maybe if we could go on mocking of Marx, we can actually get to see what he really said, which I think that is important, because it's not that you have to have a kind of Marxist. It's important to differentiate Marx from Marxism, in the sense that I believe that Marx must be known because he's a classic. Without Marx, you don't have a complete picture of the history of thought. And in that sense, so many of his ideas resonate today, that it was that reverse engineering of the mocking, of the ridicule that he's been surrounded. Right. In the general media.
Well, so there are a number of ways we could think about this. One is to think about the puppet as the medium for producing Marx, but it's not just Marx that you're producing. It's producing a whole history of what you think of as kind of revolutionary economic thought, or some kind of site of struggle of revolutionary and economic thought. And so one thing we riffed about when we were thinking about what would be interesting to talk about is the pedagogy of the puppet. Mm-hmm. And how does the pedagogy of the puppet produce a different kind of platform for having political thoughts that in ordinary realist modes might not be able to be encountered? Because in ordinary realist modes, you'd say things like, this was a failed philosophy. But when it's a puppet, you don't think this was a failed philosophy. You think this is a puppet. So we're going to talk more about comedy later, but just thinking about how a puppet might express forms of social relationality and different ways of asking the question of justice and freedom and fairness and belonging and being with and commons and so on. So I think one way we could think about this was, why that mode? And so, I don't know.
Yeah, I want to suggest, because I was thinking too about, in some ways it seemed to me that puppets are a particularly appropriate way for dealing with Marx's work. But I think, because I was thinking about three ways of approaching puppets in Marx. And the first two, I think, are not yours. And the third, which is most interesting, I think is yours. So here's the three. The first one is, I would say, and the ones differ in terms of what I would call the ontology of the puppet. These first two really have to do with the puppet as stand-in for something behind it. So here's the first one, is a sort of a traditional left populist notion of the puppet, which is that the puppet as victim, that there are master forces behind us that are controlling us and making us do what we think. Think of ideology in a certain kind of Marxism. That it's a dominant discourse that's speaking through us, and we are just following what's happening. So we are like the puppets, and puppet as victim that's just obeying what's being told. Okay. The second one is not puppet as victim, but puppet as villain. And so in Marx here, I'm thinking about commodity fetishism. So when Marx is thinking about the fetishism of commodities, it's about the animated thing, the commodity, that is in a way stealing the life from those who are really alive, the workers who are making it. So in Marx's way of thinking about it, in the market, commodities become fetishized, they become like subjects because commodities relate to each other socially, and we, in contrast, become like things. We just carry commodities to the market. And so it's like a chiasm, it's like a reverse thing, that is, insofar as things, commodities become lifelike, like these puppets, insofar as they become lifelike, we become thing-like. And in specific, what really Marx is concerned with there is that the human labor that produced commodities is being eclipsed, and the commodity itself seems lifelike. So there I was thinking, okay, puppet as villain, not as victim. Now the third one I think is closer to you, and this is also in Marx, where Marx says at the beginning of Capital, in the preface, he's explaining his method, and he says, I'm not going to treat capitalists and workers, he says, in rosy images, like lifelike. He says, rather, I'm only going to treat capitalists and workers as personifications of economic categories. So in some ways, Marx's whole work is a drama, is a sort of theater in which concepts, these real abstractions like capital, are playing the parts. That they're like the puppets, and so that what puppets become in this third one, they're not pointing to anything behind them. That's why I'm saying like the ontology is different. It's not like the puppet is pointing to some real force that's controlling it. Here, the puppets are concepts in action, and that's what I think is happening a lot in the various clips you've done, in the various segments you've done of this, which is that it's not that the puppets are standing in for something else. The puppets are in fact more real. Like that's why it's a confusing thing, or it's an interesting challenge. Let's say when Marx says like that it's more real. It's that capital, even though it's an abstraction, rather than thinking about individual capitals or a certain amount of money or even capitalists, that capital, this abstraction, is really the subject. It's really what is pushing things, and that's what needs to be studied. This abstract thing like that is actually what's driving. And I think that the puppets, in many ways, fill that role. That's this personification of economic categories, or, I think better like that, concepts in action. So it's interesting. I think in all three of these ways, the puppet is evoking these elements of Marx. And like I say, the third one is my preferred one, I guess. The first two are present in Marx, and maybe even present in your use of puppets with Marx. Yeah, what are they? But they're both sort of victim narratives, I guess. One is we're victims of ideology. The others were victims of commodities which have sucked the life out of us. But this third one I find much more interesting, and it's not a victim narrative where the puppets are really a forum for really working out ideas, and maybe a better forum than others. And what do you think about that?
I think it's very interesting because this third category that you outline, I think that there's like certain room to play when you, instead of working with actors, let's say that you're working with puppets, because instead of trying to convey like the real persona through acting, there's like this meta level where you are aware that they are puppets, and then they may have like that register where there's like, okay, this is the historical figure, but this is also a puppet who's at times aware that it's a puppet himself, and then because they are treated in this, I mean, like even the set is a little bit like a giant playhouse where you can move more freely, and that some of these figures that are in a way untractable because of all the kind of weight they have historically there's more room for spontaneity. And this is something that we've been like experimenting in the last days here, shooting at the Walker, these sketches, because we just like maybe instead of working on a script, we had like this idea, okay, well, let's make a sketch about like surplus value or about alienation or these kind of ideas as you mentioned. But mixing that with just like improvisation in a way that only puppets allow you to do.
Actually, I have something to say about that too, which is because there's another way to think about humans as puppets, workers as puppets, and then the puppets in relation to workers, which is also about collaboration and the difficulty when you're doing a collaboration of distinguishing play, creativity, and work, which is so much a part of like contemporary problematics of the calling out of the entire sensual body to create value for other people, which is when we were thinking about the puppet thing, the thing that I kept thinking about was proprioception, how Marx has great descriptions of the way the worker's body is kind of destroyed and built back up so that it can actually see itself only as a subject of work, like under capitalism. Being sick is defined as can't go to work, and being healthy is defined as can go to work, and Sudafed, which I think is evil, is about being able to go to work even though you're sick and having no time actually to. I'm sure I'll get sued for this. It's not evil. It's just has an unfortunate use, which is that it actually makes you feel healthy when you're sick. So anyway, but just the idea, then at least you can feel like you're still productive, and if you're still productive, that means you're actually a contributing member of society, and which means you're not a puppet because it shows that you're actually using your agency in any way, but using your agency in that way shows that you are a puppet because your body has been trained to think of itself as something in relation to work. So, what I'm saying is that one of the things I thought a lot about when I was watching the videos and watching your collaborators or your workers, work is that their bodies have to become in tune with the puppet. So the puppet has to become in tune with you and with their voices and kind of the whole desire you have for the social to be a place with which you can stay in sync. And so another way to think about the puppets is in terms of Marxism, is that it's also about the way the body is trained to be a worker, but to see itself as sovereign in the moment of its training,
Mm-hmm.
And yet that sovereignty is a collaborative and relational sovereignty. So that's one thing I was thinking about just when you were talking about how you couldn't ever think about the puppets without thinking about who you were working with and where you were working, and how your original scripts get distorted or upended by the work of improvisation, which is the work of having to let another person in and then figure out how you can ride with each other. So that's one thing I was thinking about when I was watching this, and that goes to a second point, which has to do with the ways that putting Marx in the body of a puppet, or putting any political theorist in the body of a puppet, it's also about trying to democratize our overwhelming knowledge. Like there is a pedagogical purpose to your translation of a lot of complicated theory to phrases that wooden beings say to each other in a situation. I wonder if you could think about like the relationship between the laboring puppet and the pedagogical puppet.
Well, the thing is, if reading like Marxism or Marx is like hard to read. It's like very dreadful subject sometimes. Like it can be like really heavy.
You mean painful?
Like especially Marx's Leninist logic, for instance, like which is like the thickest thing that you can read. It's like it's like. And so in that sense, the way, how do you take one idea, and then I think in terms of, for instance, the character design, like for instance, like other characters like Frederick Taylor, who was obsessed with time management and
you turn him into a metronome.
Yes, and also it's like his shape is like a sand clock, like and all this kind of like how do you create characters out of ideas, both in the character design and the sketches, is something that becomes, it's like an exercise to make those ideas graspable or that you can get hold of them. Although always you have the opposite risk, which is that you turn them into very monodimensional entities. And for the sake of comedy, it's not like you always you praise their achievements, but more like you mock on their weaknesses, or like their worldview becomes like a bias that you can then ridiculized.
Well, this goes to something I was saying to Michael earlier. Marx doesn't really understand what the factory is. In the clip that we showed, he's like, it was made in a factory, and he's like, whoa. But he doesn't know what like the factory is. And I was thinking that there's another thing that commodity fetishism does that isn't just an evil thing, which is that once you're trained in Marxism, then you know that the commodity is the invisibilizer and coordinator of two different histories, the history of production and the history of consumption, and that you can't tell those histories from the body of the commodity, but once you learn that the commodity is an incitement to curiosity, then you start wanting to have curiosity about what the conditions of the production of that thing is. So I was thinking, if I'd had time, I would have looked and seen what the factory actually was before it was the factory. And that part of what you're also training people in, and what teaching trains people in, is curiosity. What are the things you could be paying attention to that would go from a kind of mute object, like the thing's thingness, to a kind of question mark that you would want to pursue. And so that even the reduction of complex theory to something simple is also training in what you would call reverse engineering, or training in curiosity and scholarship and trying to figure out all the different kind of histories that object coordinates. So the comic part of the puppet is also a kind of training in historicism in a funny way, because then you kind of say, well, who is this thing? It's not just the phrases that we use to find them, but the phrases themselves are inadequate, so I have to find out more. And that's something you want, right?
Yeah, so Lauren, can you say more about, the comedy or humor or even laughter in terms of political pedagogy in a project like this?
Yeah, well, there are a million things to say about that. So we, start with one.
Yeah.
So, but also, I want you to talk about this too, Pedro, to try to think, what is the lubricant that comedy provides, or what is the opening that comedy provides, or what is the cushion? I mean, just all the metaphors, what does it mean to have a place in which, what's the relationship? In my work, one of the things I think about a lot is how do you turn stories about pain into entertainment?
Yeah.
But it doesn't become not pain when it's entertainment. So it's, at a certain meta level or a genre level or something, you're getting pleasure. And this is always a complicated situation, It creates a lot of ambivalence for the people who encounter that and think about it critically. But anyway, there's the pleasure in the genre, and then there's the stories that it's connected to that are, in this case, the stories of exploitation and the stories of the destruction of bodily health on the way to producing value for others and all those other kinds of stories. So one thing is, and also I was thinking a lot this weekend as I was preparing for this about, London is burning, and I'm going to talk about puppets. And so, but that's funny, which tells you something. So, what does it tell you? So I have lots of thoughts about this, but let me just turn it back over to you.
What part do you want me to respond?
Well, I know. Well, respond to whatever. So one thing is about how do you use comedy in a time of crisis?
Yeah.
Where the comedy isn't merely an escape valve, like that notion of comedy, right?
Well, I think that this is a challenge that this project in particular has, which is that, for instance, I was hoping I could collaborate with a writer in order to develop this project. But then you go, I was then, first trying to get some ideas about what are the main basic notions that this project should provide as a means to economic literacy and political literacy. And then, a meeting with academics, it turns out that they're not funny. You are funny, but some others not. And then, with people who write comedy, they were not interested in the subject, and then the thing is, I believe that if you have to choose between A and B, you should do A and B.
Yeah.
So the idea is that there are some kind of dumb jokes that should resonate to anyone who's not acquainted with the subject, and then some insider jokes that should resonate to the ones who are acquainted to the subject, and then you do this mix, and some people laughed at some jokes and others don't. But it's in the context of I believe that the the political, like thinking about like the roller coaster of the financial market in the last week, and then like the riots in London, etc. There is curiosity on the subject. So I think that in that sense, that curiosity will go on, and that has to be like responded in a certain way, no?
Right, but I think there's a difference between jokes and comedy. So it's worth noting, Bergson talks a lot about comedy as the mechanical encrusted on the real. And that what comedy is the acknowledgement of the breakdown of a machine.
Can you repeat that?
The mechanical encrusted on the real.
Uh-huh. Comedy is the mechanical encrusted on the real.
Yeah, the comic is that right. And so there are lots of things one could say about comedy, about the project of things that don't fit, trying to stay in sync, that kind of thing, that form of screwball comedy, or the machinery breaking down, which is, going into slapstick. And of course, when one is seeing tragedy, it's also the machinery breaking down. So what's the difference between the tragic story of the machinery breaking down and the comic story of the machinery breaking down? How does the comic version of it not negate the tragic version of it, but actually create a kind of some space for thinking about that, like the kind of surprise or interruption or opening that. So it's not just about whether jokes are funny. I mean, because a lot of comedy isn't funny. It's just about trying to maintain some optimism or attachment to the world, or trying to maintain, something like that. You see the same object that the other people see. Like I've been thinking a lot about stand-up comedy or recent stand-up comedy recently, and the way that it's a comedy of observation, so that we all see the same situation, and we see it as crisis, and we also see it as like a nightmare, and also we're in disbelief. And disbelief is a great comic genre. The deadpan, the moment, like, I don't know how to respond to this thing. And I think lots of us in political crisis time say, I don't know how to respond to this thing. And one of the genres of not knowing how to respond to this thing is the comic, because you're just thrown back by it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was thinking that one of the things that I think the comic does here for you, or the comic, I guess that's right, is to try to separate us from the present. And I was thinking this in two ways. So like that, separate us from the present, both in terms of perspective, like we could see things anew, but also separation from the present, separation from the fatality of the present, like separation from, and this seems to me actually one of the general challenges of political pedagogy today, which is that maybe everyone in each time feels this way, but I feel like that we're living in a time when it seems like the forces of domination are such that it's absolutely impossible to change the world. That it's absolutely impossible to do something different. And that's what I mean by an attachment to the fatality of the present. Like, it's a little bit like the quip that's either credited to Frederick Jameson or Slavoj Žižek, that when they're watching Hollywood movies, saying something like, it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think it's a similar way that there's such a belief in the enormity of whatever the weapons of the U.S. and precision of the U.S. military, or the financial power of Wall Street, all these things that tie us to the fatality of the present. That's what I mean. And so I think part of what the humor is doing for you is to separate us from some of that. I mean, there some uses of humor, some uses of irony actually tie us to the fatality of the present. It's like kind of, and Lauren was sort of, I think some of the instances you're talking about are that would be like, I don't know, a certain kind of pleasure in a shared suffering. Like, we're all in this together, we're all fucked. But I'm much more interested in the kind of humor that allows us that kind of separation, and then to see things differently. And that's what that's sort of what the gesture also of the returning to the texts. That, like I say, I mean, it might be hard in this context because Lauren and I have seen a lot of different iterations of this, and then we keep talking about them. They aren't the ones you've seen, but there are many iterations of this that do deal with both with Marx's texts, and then Che appears, and then Lenin appears, etc. And that I think that this return to the text is also a kind of separation from the present. That's what both the humor and then that strategy are both as a kind of pedagogy of affording this distance that allows for the possibility of thinking something different. Mm-hmm. How do you see the pedagogical value of this in that regard?
Well, I would tie it with the idea of comedy, in the sense that I'm thinking of what you were saying about like comedy. Probably I see comedy like as two kinds of balloons. One balloon could be that you have like suddenly like a kind of idea, like these overwhelming perceptions that we have over, like the powers of the world, and comedy can be like a kind of like a nail that pins an overinflated idea, and suddenly it pops. No, so it can be like a strategy like that. Other way is that I see it as other kind of balloon, which is like an airbag. So you have like this kind of collision between like thesis and antithesis, no? Like your expectations of reality, which is your thesis, and reality, which is the antithesis, and then this kind of airbag where you like have this kind of a synthesis where you explode as laughter. So it's like, but in that collision, what happens is that you deliver the idea and its opposite in such a fast way that jokes end up being the most effective way to deliver content. No, if you are telling a joke, you laugh, it's because you really got it. Otherwise, maybe you fake that you're laughing and you really didn't got it. But that delivery is like the most effective way to reach a subject, and I think that the United States has like the most sophisticated political comedy, for instance, with The Onion or The Daily Show, or a number of great school of comedy that really is like the place where you get like that when you fulfill your need to understand what's going on in the world. Other subject is where their laughter like reinforces the status quo, or actually deconstructs and helps to weaken that overwhelming controlling powers. I don't know. That's like always something that is like certain inquiry on comedy, where it's like, I don't know, probably there's not like one single answer.
Well, actually, they're related in contemporary American political comedy. They're related to each other, because the second thing you described is kind of the Rabelaisian model, the old carnival model, where you take the leader's body and you make it a big, grotesque thing. And in using strategies of the grotesque and exaggeration and hyperbole, you make it small. And so there's this kind of, scale inversion that goes on all the time. But the Onion and Jon Stewart, I mean, their major strategy of inducing political consciousness is the WTF strategy, which is they say, this thing happened, WTF? Like man continues not to like Hillary Clinton, WTF? So so that there's this way in which their deadpanness produces a kind of shared world of alienation. Mm-hmm. And that's really different than turning power into grotesque or not grotesque. The idea there would be that ordinary life and power, that everything that involves the reproduction of the ordinary is out of sync, is out of scale, so it's not just power that's out of scale, but power in relation to ordinary desire.
I just want to add one thing with that, which is I think that there's one thing Pedro's doing with Marx as puppet, which goes slightly different than that, because you are mocking Marx as puppet.
Yeah.
But you're mocking him in order to take him seriously. I mean, that's the sort of double action. In fact, I don't know if it sounds contradictory, but I imagine that that's the permission to take Marx seriously is done because you're deflating him, by making him risible and a puppet.
Well, we were talking before about like what it means to make a Marxist situation comedy, right? So in some ways, the thing is, it's not. Who knows what's going to happen with Baby Marx? Whether there'll be more and more episodes, but in a situation comedy, Marx puppet, can't adjust to the new world, right? He can't adjust to Warhol. He can't adjust. He's like feeling grumpy and all exploitation-y. And Adam Smith says, it's getting a little old, your proletarianization. And that's not right either. But whatever, they're just grasping for stuff. And in a situation comedy, the thing is that here now Marx is like Bill Cosby or Everyone Loves Raymond or something, or like, oh look, he can't adjust, but there's a world for him. So that already produces a genre for him he didn't have before you made a puppet show for him, which is the possibility that there would be a world of generosity for his thought. And as opposed to the situation tragedy world in which his thought just looks like a kind of like sad, thing that doesn't have a future or something like that.
Yeah. But the thing is that when you are holding a puppet, and we were looking at, for instance, like some interaction when the puppeteers were like, we were shooting and some kid or person would like come, and even people from the press would like very like, oh well, like, okay, we really with the ones we really want to talk to is with the puppets, and they would like have an interview with the puppets in such a way that the puppet does create this space where you can deal with that with the character, and it's less weight. Like it doesn't matter if you get it wrong, and that's very important in order to have access to that, because not having access to certain such an important philosophical spectrum as Marx has had in history. I do believe that it's hard for a lot of people to come closer to the subject. So that's a little bit like the kind of. But I wouldn't like mention this to Marx only. I mean, like Smith himself is like even less known and more misquoted than Marx. For instance, I mean, his writings about moral sentiment and all this. Nobody is discussing this. And it's I think that there's so much to find in all the.
Although really, in the academy, there's a lot of discussion of the theory of moral sentiments, and it's always like, well, invisible hand over here, capitalism over here, theory of moral sentiments over there, compassion as the lubricant for social intimacy over here, exploitation and instrumentality over there. So, one of the things that one would have to do is to ask, what's the relationship between these?
And do you feel these two schools talk to each other or not much?
What I think is that people love the theory of moral sentiments because it looks like the social is really an effect of affective commitment, or your body does it without you asking it to. Your body responds, your body puts itself in the position of other people's bodies, and then you get to experience yourself as a part of the social, and it looks like there's an affective democracy, and that works out really well in capitalism. To have, and I was being ironic, that's correct. To have a model of liberal society that in which people can have a thought that their fundamental class antagonism in relation to each other is, as it were, beside the point if they can feel right and feel democratic. So the whole question of the relationship between democracy as a structural thing and an affective thing keeps becoming unasked again and again. So, and the splitting off of the invisible hand version of capitalism, where there's just kind of a machine that will make things right, a self-regulating market, an autopoietic market, and then you have an autopoietic affective economy, and it looks like they'll work together, but of course they work together in order to protect this, the right-wing hand doesn't have to know what the left-wing hand is doing in that regard.
But I mean, for instance, and I don't know, coming from the context of Mexico, it's impossible to think of an intellectual who's not within a Marxist tradition, but how does that is like in the academia here?
Well, a lot of people got fired during the Cold War. For a lot of people, American universities would be a very, very different place. A lot of people got fired in the Cold War for having any association with Marxist thought at all. And in sociology departments, political science departments, many, now people always say English departments are the last refuge of Marxism. That's not really true. But there's some basis to a thought that, that it gets preserved as text and concept and idea more often than it gets preserved as a thing whose business is still unfinished. So That's, I don't know, I don't want to.
Well, my perception is, I mean, it's hard to make these sort of arcs, but, and maybe some of you are going to have better version of this than us, but that from a repression against Marxist thought, both in militancy and in unions and in intellectual realm, we pass to a kind of ridicule of Marxist thought. But my perception is the last 10 or 15 years that there's a genuine and growing both curiosity and knowledge of Marxist thought in the U.S. too. Like that, I think that what you're pointing to, in my perception, is changing an older model in which, in Europe and Latin America, all intellectuals, at least of a certain, humanities and social sciences, had a certain kind of foundation in Marx, and in the U.S. not. My perception is it's changing on both regards, actually. Like that both there's a less of a hegemony of Marxism or focus on Marxism in outside of the U.S. and in the U.S. There's in fact in this sort of professional realm of Marxologists or something. If I could talk as that thing. I think what's written in the U.S. is much more interesting than elsewhere now.
Mm-hmm. But you're really just talking about the academy. I mean, the split between the academy and popular political culture is much bigger here in that regard than in Europe or in Mexico. I mean, because there's a lot more public intellectual work and all sorts of other things. I mean, as far as I can tell, in the era of austerity, there's less public sphere discussion of what it might mean to socialize, like the whole question of socializing the wealth. Socializing is a very scary term in those things. And so they talk a lot about, protecting the wealth for the wealthy and socializing the pain and things like that. So in the U.S., I think it's really the really big crisis is in the non-communicativeness of academic theory in relation to popular imaginaries for what democracy could be like under a regime of austerity. To whom is austerity addressed? And people have, they say things like we should share the pain. The closest you can come to hearing, well, I have two thoughts about this. One is that I was listening to this union guy on the radio, and he was saying that we should share the prosperity. That was his way of translating share the austerity. And I thought that was really interesting. But sharing in the U.S. looks like anti-market freedom. It looks like a constraint on sovereignty. And there's, many, many years of neoliberalism has made it very hard to imagine forms of genuine economic interdependency where interdependency doesn't look like, let me get my sentence correct. It's very hard for people to imagine dependency as something other than weakness or blockage to sovereignty. And what you want is dependency to look like solidarity. And there's no popular idiom for that.
I think it might be the moment to start with questions. We have a means for people to make comments and questions.
Awesome, thanks. Well, I'm Adair. I have a question that's mostly for Pedro, but could be for everybody. This artwork is called Baby Marx, but it's not really for babies. And that kind of made me think about the question of children as a potential audience for this. Because, puppets, sort of things like this are a genre that we associate with children. But it seems like you've made a film, at least this one that I've seen, for adults. And I guess the question that's kind of behind that is how much do all these sort of things that we're talking about this work, rely on the idea of a critical audience? An audience who will get the sort of double back, it's not what it appears to be. And I was wondering how the three of you think that it might be possible to talk about this artwork if we can't rely on audience criticality.
Well, I think that there is, even in the kind of big commercial releases that are meant for children, there's also like certain jokes that are for another audience. But in general, like my feel about a children audience, which this is also, like a thought for, is that kids are smarter than adults in certain ways, or that you can get. I mean, like, I don't know. Like, for me, it's very. For instance, like when I was a kid, I was reading, for instance, Mafalda. Mafalda is like a kind of comic strip, which is very politically charged, and like there's like all this. There were all these kind of jokes about Vietnam or the Kremlin or the Chinese, and and I remember laughing at them without even knowing what they were talking about. Also, for instance, my parents didn't allow me to watch any Walt Disney movies because they thought that I could get like a kind of distorted perception of reality. Yes, like they said, oh well, like animals don't speak, and I could not have like any kind of Star Wars toys and none of that. But I think that like the visual side is has like certain level, and there's like another level of conversation that you can understand. So I don't think that you necessarily have to acquire any knowledge to watch at it, but rather that by watching at it, you're gonna have that's gonna save you from having to read the books, and then maybe you're curious enough to go on Wikipedia something. So that's a little bit like the kind of hope that I have.
Mm-hmm. There's one over behind you. Oh, you got one too. Okay. Oh, the microphone.
Hello? Does it say? It does. Good. Look. Oh. Sorry, I just made the microphone work. I'm over here.
Good. Okay. Up here.
Yes. Okay. Comedy. Back to comedy. This is reductive and binary and may be useful. Definitions of comedy and tragedy. That tragedy is about irrevocable things, and in comedy, anything can be taken back. So this is reaction. It can be reactionary in that any disruption to consensus reality can be smoothed over and made to go away at the end of the sitcom, but that disruption that happens in the middle before things get smoothed over, what can happen there? What can happen there with puppets? Can you go back and talk about that again for a bit? That's my question.
I think Lauren has like a good answer for the tragedy and the comic.
Oh.
I don't know.
Well, so one thing is every genre, one of the things that defines a genre are the modes of obstacle that happen in the middle of them. So every romance threatens not to be a romance, and every detection story threatens not to be a detection story because part of its part of its pleasure is that it will deliver a certain kind of plot, and part of its pleasure is the possibility that it will be something other than it was, and then it would be unintelligible too. So the fact that there is a knot in the middle doesn't make it especially comic or especially tragic. It's the question of, as you say, it's the question of whether or not there is something, what happens at the end, right? So in Cruel Optimism, I talk about the difference between situation comedy and situation tragedy. And in a situation comedy, as I said, you can't adjust and everybody loves you anyway. And there's a world for you. And the world is generous and the world has time for you, even though part of the thing it has time for are the ways that you can't adjust, which would be amazing if there were actually a world like that. And I think one of the things I'm thinking a lot about in political theory is what would it mean to be trained to think of the world as a space that had time for that, right? And the social as a place where you could slow down and wait for something to happen, rather than a thing that you had to have an immediate and have a tragic relation to. We know what the event is, rather than a comic relation to. We don't know what the event is. But in a situation tragedy, so the office is the locus classicus of a situation tragedy. There's a person who can't adjust, and everybody is protecting that person from the knowledge that they have about him, about the way he can't adjust. But if he got that knowledge, he would lose everything and he'd become psychotic. So you actually want to protect his distortion and disavowal, and it kind of tears you up inside, and it's not funny. Okay, but the reason it's a situation tragedy is because he's living one membrane away from losing everything. Okay, and so when we think about the question of the crisis of the social, part of what's really interesting is to ask: is optimism Are modes of optimism actually, situation tragedy? Or do you need modes of optimism in order to be able to stay tethered to the possibility that the social could become genuinely comic again? Those are the kinds of ways that I would riff off the question that you asked. And one thing is, in contrast to Michael's reading of what Pedro's doing, this isn't really about the historical present in its representation. I mean, this is art that's happening amidst crisis. But it's not exactly the crisis of our historical present. And I think that's partly why it's science fiction. This is the future. And you have a microwave that malfunctions, and a book becomes a body, and a body becomes a set of phrases. And it's really about the possibility of inducing a different historical present from something accidental, rather than like seeing the way in which the problem of the reproduction of life as it thickly is experienced right now. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not really sure it's about the historical present being interrupted, but I think there's some other way in which you could talk about science fiction. You could talk about what it means that archaic forms and futurist forms are put in the same place. There's a long tradition of political puppeteering, for example. We talked about this a little bit before, and they're unreal both in archaic terms, like they're mythic or something like that, and unreal in futuristic terms because there isn't a world for them yet, and so they open up the possibility of another world. And what Adorno's definition of committed art is: the art that says it could be otherwise. And so when you use in a moment of crisis, when you don't go to realism, but you go to a kind of surrealism or infantile surrealism. We should have a name for this. Maybe that would be it. Anyway, but that wouldn't be an insult to it. It would be a positive thing. It has to do with some kind of, trying to make an opening, trying to make a mode of representation for the possibility of something without it being about the suffering that's going on in the background of it. Like, could you imagine a version of this that would include the fires on the streets? Not really. The artificiality of the mise en scène is a really important part of it.
I was thinking about the temporality of it, and I'm not sure if you all before have been in the exhibit space, should we call it that? And so it's a complicated temporality because that library that's the main scene there is, I assume, from about 1960, more or less any part in the world. Could be North or South America, or probably many other places. It looks like a lot of life. So the scene is, it's not the present. And then we get these figures from 150, 200 years ago that come through the microwave, which was already a kind of 60s version of science fiction. But I read all of that as modes of a defamiliarization with our present, but that is actually aimed at the present. I mean, that's the way I read. That's the way I'm interpreting the project too, as that this theater of ideas, that you have with the various figures, Marx and Smith, but also Lenin and Che and
Milton
Mao,
Friedman,
and Milton Friedman, that these are necessary for understanding our present, or that's the way I read it. And so that we want the defamiliarization with these. Like I say, it's a very complex back and forth temporality because it's the future. It's 200 years ago. It's also 1960s science fiction.
Yes.
But all of that in order to, I think, if not having the fires of London there, but I assume that part of your provocation to the viewers is that you need these ideas to understand your world.
I totally think so. I mean, the big drama of contemporary society, I believe, is that because we lack knowledge of our lack of education, is like making us ill-equipped to make sense of the world and to reimagine the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that I don't know, and it has to do with acts of violence. I mean, if you look at the last month, for instance, there was like a kind of terrorist attack in Norway with the kind of, which is like coming from the extreme right, and then, or a kind of they actually like shot like a kind of camp of Marxist students, and then there's like the rioting in London, which is like which is hatred of this kind of like a like economic situation, and you have. For instance, I was thinking of a phrase by Lenin, which used to say that terrorism is a fist without an arm. Like it's something that is not like that doesn't belongs to one or like one political ideology or in particular, but that is like something that is used, that can be used. And I think that often, like for instance, like one of the main problems is that it's that sometimes terrorism has been like a word that has somehow like assigned to a kind of a certain group where there's like everyone can become a terrorist regardless of his like beliefs. And so, for instance, I was thinking, well, this is a phrase that Lenin said, which is like whenever you hear a quotation from Lenin, it's even more ridiculous than Marx. But nevertheless, like I thought, well, like I read that from Lenin, and it's like something that you start to make sense of the world, and there may be things that even I think that Milton Friedman got right. I mean, like the thing is that you cannot like have unidimensional I mean, we have to become more elaborate on how do we read and like these ideas, like and just like makes they help you to understand the world, and in that sense, it is connected with the current state of the world, I think.
Well, one thing you said that I really like is just that a phrase is like a wedge in history, so that the phrase is something in your head, and that you have an encounter, and the encounter it's like a dust magnet or something. It's like it starts to accrue to the phrase, and you get a different kind of consciousness because of that. And that's one way that I think the puppet show really works as a kind of infantile pedagogy in really interesting ways. And the other thing is, I was thinking about the Mingus song, all the things you would be right now if Sigmund Freud's wife were your mother. And I was thinking that in some ways, which is like one of the best titles of anything ever, and that I was thinking in some ways you're saying something like that about the preconditions for understanding the historical present, like all the things you would need to know to understand the mess of the present, which isn't just about dramatic events, but also about the ongoing work of the problem of the reproduction of life in the everyday. So those two things I thought of.
Yeah. Does someone have the microphone
many hands.
already?
Any mic?
Okay.
I wanted to know.
Yeah, you're
there.
You're on. Yeah.
I'm interested in thinking about the difference between talking about ideas in comedy being an open-ended question versus talking about something in a serious realm when it seems like the idea of a fact is now completely in question, like there's an assault on anything that is factual. Any opinion can be thrown away, but if you ask it as a question in a comic way, there's no way to shut it down. So I just wanted to know if that's what you mean when you say you're talking it through the puppets.
Yeah. I think that it's a very interesting question. I think that there's like it's very important that there's that we allow also like people who are like fully convinced and engaged, and and I do think so that can be like a honest like motivation, and I feel very committed to like certain causes that for instance, like I am on a crusade against like gun availability in Mexico. Like there's like a kind of big problem, and it's had to do with international policy. But in the context of this particular project, that is something that has that space where you don't take it seriously is like a warm up. Like you need to warm up this discussion. And loosen up. You cannot. If we were to to talk about like Marx in a serious way, you have probably most of the others have left by now. I don't know. I tried to make a joke.
But as I said, most jokes aren't funny. It doesn't mean they're not jokes.
Yeah. Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Here, right here,
oh, yes.
in front.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Hi. Now, London has been invoked a couple of times now, and I was wondering, how do you, as Marxist, that means if you identify as such, look at these riots, and to what extent do you think a Marxist perspective may help to explain these riots, and where does it fall short?
I have to say what I think? Shit. I was trying to get out of that.
That's funny.
No, it's that it's not the kind of thing one can do quickly.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. I mean, one could say, I feel like the things I can say quickly feel like just the two obvious ones, which is that of course there's indignation and revolt when we're made to pay for your crisis. You know, when the social services are cut from. I don't think that's a particularly Marxist analysis. I mean, I guess this, maybe the first way of approaching this is saying I don't think one doesn't need Marx to understand a lot of what's going on with this, and then there are certain things which Marx's own work were blind to that are extremely important in this, like the racial relations that are implied and involved in this. So I don't. Like on the one hand, I think Marx is in a way to. You don't need to go to Marx. You know, there's many. It seems much more obvious. And the other way that I think Marx doesn't help, just because of his own limitations with certain things which seem essential to it to me. Sorry, I fumbled a bit there.
Well, I mean, if we didn't fumble, we would just be puppets. So, I think there are other things to say too. This was incited by a police shooting. So one thing we want to think about. So we just, it's an overdetermined situation, right? So, but a few things. Just thinking about youth unemployment globally, and how all over, so much of the unrest all over Europe, so much of the genuine autopoietic public revolt all over Europe, it has to do with 30% youth unemployment. And very, very, it's not unimaginable in the United States, but like an unbelievably big civil servant society that that the grown-ups get to, well, actually they get to retire at 50, which I think is great, but it's, anyway. But they're not being replaced by youth. So there's the huge problem in youth unemployment. There are no jobs. So one of the things that happens is that many people are now talking about the rapid expansion of public education in the US and all over Europe as a jobs program for the youth for whom there were no jobs. Then public education starts getting cut back and privatized all over Europe and in the US. And then the youth who are no longer able to afford the education that had been their entitlement as citizens and that they had never known anything but as entitlement as citizens, it turns out that was a jobs program, and now there is nothing, there are no jobs for them, there is no education for them that they don't have to go into massive debt for. And the same thing is true about the military, that the military is one of the biggest jobs programs for youth in the United States and all over Europe. And so when the different militaries start to shrink because they are also too expensive for, the body politic is too expensive for its own state. That's a very bad situation, but it's especially bad for youth. So a lot of different kinds of economic forces are coming to bear on this situation, and I'm not sure if that's a Marxist analysis or not, but anyway, trying to think about that and trying to think about the difference between a political symptom and a political expression, I think is important. Like one could make an analysis of all of the different ways in which people are just fed up with the state's abandonment of them. And the idea of the state abandoning its own body politic that it's supposed to be representing is a very powerful one in a lot of anarchist and popular social movements all over the UK and Europe and somewhat in the US. But also, there are no youth clubs anymore in England right now. So one of the things that when you read interviews of writers, they say, well, there's nothing for us to do. We don't even know what to do with the world that isn't there for us anymore. So it's, the problem of the good life no longer having any traction in material and most people's material consciousness means that it's not even clear what a life is. And then I think it's easier for people to kind of give up on the social at those moments. And the more people give up on the social, the more the neoliberal state really likes it. And so the riots are both a giving up on it, but also a claiming of it, So it's a complicated situation, and it's 7 minutes old, so what do we know?
This is a question based on one of the topics that you were discussing regarding the relation between comedy and politics, specifically in regards to pedagogy. And it's more of a comment than a question that I'd invite any of you to respond to, but in some ways it's tailored towards Pedro. I was taken by the relationship you established between Adam Smith and Marx that we saw in the introduction, and that is apparent in the exhibition, where one of the skits that I saw is Engels and talking to Marx and talking about, your Marxist purity has been tainted by hanging out with Adam Smith too long, and I'm worried about you, Carl. It's, no, I'm the same old guy. And they're actually friends, and it's less confrontational than one would imagine that kind of interaction to actually be like. And I found that's possible because you chose comedy, and specifically in a kind of South Park tradition, you chose puppets instead of animation, but it allows you to take liberties that normally would be found ridiculous in another medium, perhaps. And I found that to be a very smart move, and I guess I want to confirm whether what I perceived was a conscious strategy or just a kind of a very smart mistake or side effect. And it's the fact that by making them less confrontational and more friendly in that regard, that it invites people to make political reconsiderations that they may not make otherwise. In other words, that we're so used to this discussion between capitalism and Marxism and different types of political economy as being a conversation about what side are you on and what camp do you belong to, and it's almost evolved into a kind of lifestyle choice in many ways, that making them friends and engaging in these almost absurd conversations tricks the audience into actually listening to a perspective or a conversation that they may have stopped listening to a long time ago. And if that's part of the reason why you chose this specific medium, in some ways to lessen the cult of personality that usually surrounds these figures, and more as a way of tricking the audience into actually paying attention to a perspective or an ideology that they stopped paying attention to a long time ago.
Yes.
Yeah. Next.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about fictional characters in your project. Fictional characters, and from your original trailer, there was like a passionate love scene between like Millie and Che, and so I'd love to hear like what made you put like the element of romance in this like material world, and also what kind of relationship you imagined between real characters and fictional characters.
The fictional characters, I think, that represent like the kind of curiosity about, and it's like they're the ones that allow these mistakes to happen. So I think that they also, for instance, like the two girls that they rebel against their parents, so they end up being in very different positions. I think that, it's like just probably like incarnations of my own personality in certain ways, like kind of the different affections that I have to the different authors. They were like kind of isolated into characters. So that's a little bit like a personal development So, like, they may be used only to propel the story forward. But I think that the weight of the story will always fall a little bit in existing figures. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
So I agree with Lauren that socialize has, in some sense, become almost a political dirty word, and Marx is either villainized by the right or abandoned by the left in some cases. And yet, at the same time, a lot of his criticisms of capitalism turned out to be incorrect, and capitalism evolved, and we have these later theorists, broached, Lukács, who in some ways are more relevant to our current economic situation. So do you think a project like Baby Marx is important for sort of reclaiming the memory of Marx, or as a figurehead of the left, or something else entirely?
I have sketches for Lukács and Gramsci. They will be made into puppets eventually. Yeah. No, I mean, like, you're not satisfied with the answer, it seems. But, yeah, new developments that are like always need also the kind of classical figures. So I think that they're you hopefully the project will eventually develop so we can bring more pieces into the chessboard.
But also, let's face it, I mean, you can't talk about, the whole legitimation process of modern capitalism, or I don't know, the whole isn't quite right. But anyway, has a lot to do with having elevated Marxism to its ridiculous other, right? So that it's also about that. I mean, it also has to do with the kind of caricature and the war of caricatures that have been a part of a kind of legitimation. So the putting everything into proximity does the thing that you described, which is it makes you start to think. It makes it possible to start to think substantively about it rather than in a caricatured way, even though it's being presented in a caricatured way. But also, the question of whether whose theory works best is a slightly different kind of question than how do these forms actually prevent us thinking about the problem of capitalism in the present as well as provide the opportunity for thinking about it. But I'm not Pedro, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's the best time to
That was beautiful.
stop.
Yeah.
Thanks very much
Thanks.
for coming. Do you have a next?